Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Asian Hustle Network podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us. Her name is Anna Lee. Anna is the co founder and head of engineering at award winning Lioness, the women led sexual wellness company that built the world's first and only smart vibrator that gives you orgasm and arousal data to help improve understanding of sexual pleasure through science. Before Lioness, Anna was previously a mechanical engineer at Amazon, launching the Dash Buttons original concept and the Kindle Voyage page press technology. She has most recently been named Forbes 30 Under 30, featured in a full spread in the Times Magazine, and named Paper Magazine's Asian Women Creators You Need to Know. She is a big advocate in Lioness's mission to expand the research in sexual health and destigmatize female sexuality. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Anna, we're so excited to have you on the show. And just for more context of how we met, I think we met at like some LA event, and everyone kept tapping my shoulder in my shoulders. They're like, "You have to meet this girl named Anna." And then I look around, I see you like running around talking to a lot of people. I'm like, "Oh man, like there's no way I'm gonna talk to you." But lo and behold, I'm so happy we have you here on the podcast today. We're so excited to dive deep into your story.
Oh, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's always fun to talk about, I think, sex stuff.
Hmm.
As much as it's like, ooh, scary and taboo, but I promise it's gonna be so fun, so harmless. Like it's gonna be great.
Yeah, let's take it back to the beginning. Like, what was your upbringing like? Where'd you grow up, and what were you taught about entrepreneurship as a young child?
That's a good question. So I grew up, I was born in LA, but when I was a baby, we moved back to Korea and then I lived there till I was 6. So I always say like Korea's my first home. And I like, came back to America not knowing English, so starting from ESL and all of that. But I grew up in kind of your traditional, really strict, religious, conservative family. Like we really came on this mindset of coming for the American dream and my parents sacrificing their, immigrating to the US without knowing anything about US culture or anything like that to give my brother and me a better opportunity in life. And so I really had this mindset of I wanted to be a good engineer. Like I always liked engineering and I was like, I'm going to be a good engineer. I'm going to end up in, a corporate life. Like that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. Like that's what I was really set up to do. Um, so I was, yeah. So like, we never talked about sex. I tell this to people to this day is that well into like I was like 23, 24, I was scared of my own body. Like I never talked about sex stuff with my partners. I definitely didn't have like the communication skills to do like talk about what I liked, what I didn't like. And so when we first started the company, I wasn't ever the person like I was like, I'm just gonna engineer stuff. Like I don't want to talk about clitorises or vaginas or orgasms or any of that. Like that's not me. And so I always like to tell people that because we're 7 years later. And so I'm doing completely the opposite. So it's been a journey for me, but I started out doing like engineering, mechanical engineering at Amazon, and I really felt like this was like the American dream of what I wanted to do. And I remember like, a couple years in, I was like sitting in my cubicle and I was like, damn, is this what you're supposed to do for the rest of your life? Like I just didn't feel like I was doing everything in terms of like what I was really passionate about or like things that made me super excited every morning. Um, and ended up meeting a founder of a different sex toy company, which doesn't exist anymore. So I feel like I can talk about this company specifically. It was a male founder, and I was like, "How do you know what you're building works for people with vaginas? How do you know it's a good product?" And he was like, "There's this industry standard where you put the vibration on your nose, and that's what a clitoris feels like." And I just remember being like, "Oh my god!" Like,
Oh my God.
like the most intimate product is like made in this sense. And if you go to like sex toy conventions, a lot of times they'll be like, oh, put it on your nose or the skin between your thumb and pointer finger, because there's like nerve endings there. And like, that's like the same thing as a clitoris. And I remember just being like, what a crazy industry. And I realized it's super male dominated. So yeah, honestly, could I have imagined where we are currently that it's a full business, like we're running this company? No, like I really thought I was like, I'm going to do this project for a little bit and see what it's like. And maybe I'll just like engineer it. I just want to be like a really good engineer. So yeah, all of it's a little bit like a journey. I don't think any like company really happens overnight where you're like, I have this great idea. So even the vibrator, we are like, I want to make a cool vibrator, but I had no idea what that was going to end up being in terms of working in the research field, with doctors, working with in consumer tech, like just everything, and constantly battling, I think, taboos and policies and rules around like selling sex toys.
Wow, that is amazing. I thought it was so funny that you mentioned, you meeting that one person and they said that the touch of the nose is similar. I just think that's the funniest thing. And that's the first time I've ever heard of that. But just really appreciate you sharing like your background. I think a lot of people, especially in our Asian Hustle Network community, can relate to your story a lot. You working at Amazon and just feeling like, is this like all there is to life, And and making that jump is like the biggest thing. It is extremely, extremely hard. But I do want to know, you mentioned that your parents are very conservative. You came from a very conservative family. I want to know like what they thought about this whole thing and, what was the reaction?
I guess before we get there,
Yes.
before we get there, I'm really fascinated with the whole nose thing and the hand thing because even I, you caught my attention. I'm like, what? So
every night you're gonna be like touching your nose.
I'll be like, oh no, I'll be like, rubbing. I'm just kidding.
Oh my goodness.
I've heard like on TikTok right now, there's this whole thing about like unripe. I won't even get into it, but like unripe avocados. So that became like a whole thing. And I was just like, yeah, it's like these really silly things. I understand it in the sense of we're just trying to like have things to like,
relate
talk
to.
about it in a way to relate it. Yeah. But it's so much of like, man, that's some misinformation. Like,
can you make a TikTok video on that and just like rub your nose and be like, guys, this is wrong. Don't rub your nose a lot. You're gonna get a pimple.
So I actually totally made a TikTok about like this industry and that like it started out being like, oh yeah, it's like people put vibrations on your nose, and then it got pulled down because they were like, this is sexual content. So I was like, oh my God, we're talking about rubbing noses. But I was like,
oh my gosh. That's hilarious.
Well, we'll send TikTok an email after this. TikTok, what is going on here? It's educational.
That's what I'm really here for, is to, be like, hey, TikTok, hey, Facebook, like help us.
Let's talk a little bit more about Maggie's question, right? Like, how did your parents take your business idea? Because I know that, as you mentioned earlier, sexuality in Asian culture doesn't really mix, and we don't exactly have parents that talk to us about sex education, about having sex or sex pleasures. God knows we never even get to sex pleasures. You just procreate, right? You just have kids. You skip a bunch of steps to get there.
You're like, get married first, then date, then have baby. I don't know, like all sorts of messed up stuff. Yeah, for sure. I actually didn't tell. So I met my two co-founders who were working on this idea of an AI vibrator at the time. So we would like move and vibrate differently just as a robot, being smarter. And I was introduced to them from my roommate. And I always say like, the best thing to do in life is to like put things out there, like, and it manifests. And I was like, dude, I would want to work on a sex toy company one day. And then my roommate was like, wait, I know two people kind of working on this. So she introduced me to who are my two co-founders now. So at the time I was like, hey, I just want to help. Like, I'm not asking for equity or pay. I was like, I just want to do it. I just think it's such a cool project. And so I was going to Amazon to go to work. And then after work, I would go to Berkeley and work on this project till like 3 a.m. And then I was just doing this for like 8 months. And there was like a moment where I woke up and I missed 6 of my alarms. And my boss at Amazon was like, hey, are you coming into the office today? And I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm at a point where this is unsustainable. And I just, a little bit was like, oh, like, I'm just going to jump into, I was like, I have nothing to lose. Like, I'll go back to doing a real job if it doesn't work out. So I worked on Lioness full time. So at the time, I actually didn't tell my mom because I was like, it was zero pay. Like, we didn't pay ourselves for like a good 1.5 years when we started the company. And then, I lost health insurance, like everything. everything that my mom was probably like, don't do. So, and then I was like, on top of it's a sex toy company. So I actually didn't tell her for a long time. And then one day she was like, hey, I'm going to come visit, because I was living in San Francisco. My parents are in LA. And she was like, I just want to see how you're doing, because you're like not as responsive. You're not calling very often. And I was like, okay, this is the time that I'm going to just have to tell her. So she came to our shared desk space at the time. It was like, 10 different companies. We had like one small desk. And I was like, hey, I just want to let you know I'm working on a smart sex toy. And I was like explaining to her why it was so important to me. Because I was like, honestly, like I'm so scared of my own body. For me, it's a journey to understand my body better. And I just want to feel like I have ownership of my body, is what I explained as best as I could in Korean. But Korean's not amazing. It's like, ends as a 6-year-old me leaving Korea. And she was really quiet. And I was really like waiting for her to be like, how could you do this? Like, like you've ruined, whatever, like disown me. And then she was really quiet. And she was like, I used to own a vibrator once. And I was like, oh, okay. And then for the next 2 hours, we just sat, and she was like, we talked about different sex things. She was like giving me advice. I was giving her advice. And then she was like, when did you lose your virginity? Like, who was it to? Like, show me their picture. We just had this full-blown sex talk that we've never done it again after that. And it was the most beautifully disgusting things I've ever done in my life. Like, so beautiful in that I was so appreciative. That's how my mom responded, because I didn't think that she was going to do that. But also disgusting because, like talking about sex with your parents and then giving each other sex advice is super unnatural. And so, but I was super grateful. And I mean, I would say to this day, I'm not going to say she's like 100% supportive of like, oh, my daughter's making sex toys. Like, she's very like, when are you going to get a real job? Like, you think it's now time for you to like get into a real career? But with that, like, I think it could have been so much worse. And I think, so I'm really appreciative. And I think the biggest thing for me is when we finally finished developing our product, I was in China at the manufacturing line getting all of it done. So the first one that came off the line, I actually flew straight back to LA, and I like gave it to her, and I was like, I don't care if you use it or not, but just know, like, I was like, this is what I've been working on for the past 4 years. This is very, very like special to me. I want you to have it. So I don't know if she used it or not, but I always tell people like, man, like, if my mom, and I promise you, my mom is very scary. I was so scared of her growing up. Like, if she can come to a part where she can open up about sexual wellness and sexual pleasure, like I'm in the full belief that anyone can do it. So, yeah, overall, better than expected. My real advice to people, especially I think the Asian community, because they're always like, dude, how do you do that with an Asian parent? I'm always like, you should just scare them. If you really take this advice, please do not blame me if it doesn't work. But I'm always like, dude, scare them a little bit until one day they're just like, you know what, you just do you. And as long as you're happy, that's good enough. Like I was like, I got my first tattoo in 18, and she like cried hysterically for so long. And then I like shaved my head, and then I started like dyeing my hair all different colors. And I think the last thing before I started Lioness is I shaved my head, and she was like, not even like, she didn't really bat an eye. She was just like, oh my God, Anna just does whatever she wants. And then so when I was like, oh, I'm making this sex toy company, I think she would just kind of like, all right, like what else can I expect from this child of mine? So I think it helps.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I got like a little bit emotional when you told us that story too, because it really reminds me of like my relationship with my mom. Like she would never talk to me about sex. Like the only thing she would talk to me about it would be like, don't have sex. Like don't do it until you get married, right? But then when the time actually comes where the conversation actually comes up, like I'll just say like this one time she found a plan B on my desk, and before that point, she would never talk to me about sex. But after that point, it's like, okay, maybe I do have to have that conversation with her, and they just open up. And I think that's how a lot of Asian parents are. But we tend to forget that they were once kids too. Like they go through the same things that we do. They, our parents have had to have sex too. So they go through very, very similar things that we do. And
100%.
Yeah. And it's like when that conversation comes up, they're more open to like open up and talk to you about it and educate you about it and just like exchange experiences and stuff like that. And you start to realize like, wow, I can talk to my parents about this type of thing. And about you saying like just scare them, that is so true, because I feel like once you like rebel and you just do whatever you want to, they tend to be like, okay, you know, they've already done this like A, B, and C. I can't be any more surprised if they do X, Y, and Z. But if you like always just like stay within the lines, if you do something that's like just a tiny bit out of the lines, they like freak out. So I do agree with you that like if you scare them a little bit, they start to be like, okay, well, I'm not even surprised anymore.
So before we continue with this disclaimer, we're not giving any professional advice here.
Yeah, I'm not
no, just personal experiences, no professional advice.
Yeah, just what worked for me. You know, that's all. Like, not telling you to do it. Don't get a tattoo and say that Anna encouraged you to do it. Like, my God.
I think it's funny too.
If anything,
yeah, I have a tattoo as well before I started my entrepreneur journey. And again, like, I think my mom wasn't hysterically sad, but my dad was. He was just like, oh my God, my son has tattoos. He's an Asian gangster now.
It's the whole gangster mentality. Yeah, my mom was like, oh my God, like we can't go to saunas together, like all this stuff. And I was like, no one's looking. I was like, it's fine. Like, but yeah, I'm also like, man, like don't get a tattoo at 18 because it's very regrettable. Whatever you think is cool at 18 is not cool later.
Out of curiosity, is your tattoo like super big or is it just like something really small?
It's quite, I would say it's like, let me think. It's like 4 inches. Like it's a square, like 4 inches, and it's on my rib cage.
Oh wow!
Because I was like, if I'm gonna do a tattoo, I was like, I'm gonna do it in the most painful. I don't know what I was thinking, but it's the ugliest tattoo in existence. It ended up looking like the Black Flags. I don't if you know the band. It looks like a Black Flags tattoo, but it's not. It was supposed to be like Pareto's 80-20 principle, whatever. And then, so when I was at Burning Man 2 years ago, everyone was like, oh my God, Black Flags. And I was like, it's not a Black Flag tattoo. And I was like, I don't know what's up with it. But now I'm like, yeah, it's a Black Flags tattoo because I think it's easier to explain than me being like, at 18, I was so inspired by Pareto's principle or whatever.
But yeah, I want to talk about the product some more. You know, as you mentioned, you gave your mom the product after working on it for 4 years, right? And as you're creating this product, what was going through your mind in terms of selecting your target audience, right? Because we know, I think I know, I mean, I don't know, I just assume, this is my assumption, okay, that everyone's different, right? And I would assume that everyone's different. Ethnicity matters too, it factors into the type of vibrators and whatever they choose to pick. So how did you pick your target niche? And honestly, how did you survey your market to make sure that this is something that people would want, right? And how did you get the conversation started? Because I would imagine like a cold email, would you like to try a vibrator? It would not come out, right? Like, how did you really gain momentum and traction and feedback on your product?
That's
also,
a great
like,
question.
Competition too. Like there's so many vibrators out there. So I want to hear your thoughts on like competition as well.
Oh, interesting. So, so I guess the first off of like, how did we know that we're building in the right product? We definitely started, with this idea of the AI vibrator. The interesting thing I think we learned a lot and what surprises people is that the amount of beta people willing to beta test is actually really high. Like, especially at the time, like we were hand building it. It was like 3D printed with silicone. We hand casted. We were like soldering all the components together. It didn't look amazing. And so when we were like, hey, we have a beta list for testers, but then as soon as people hear like a free vibrator, people are like, oh yeah, I'll sign up. So then when we had a beta list open, it actually oversubscribed and we had to close it because we were like, just have too many people, and we couldn't build that fast. So I think it really proves something when people are like, oh, it's a vibrator. Like it's that little threshold of maybe you wouldn't buy one yet, or you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to put money investment into it. But when you're like, oh, you can get one, the people are like, yeah, I totally want to get it. And so when we were doing these beta tests, one of the biggest feedback we got were people saying, oh, like, I kind of know what I like. Like, I know which vibration. I'd probably keep it at the same. I can move it in this very particular way, or I don't move it once it's kind of hitting the right spot. But then the question we kept getting was, well, how do you know what I even would like or what you should change the motor settings to. And we were like, oh, like we're actually measuring your biofeedback of like your pelvic floor movements, which is one of the best indicators for arousal and orgasm. And people were like, can I see what that graph looks like? And that was where people were like, this is something that I've never seen. Like, you've never seen an orgasm charted out. And then this whole thing of, well, if you change your medication, you have a cup of coffee, something like just any factor, it will change what that graph looks like. And so people are like, that's crazy that you could see like a direct physiological difference, just as if you're tracking sleep or walking or exercise fitness, all of that. So it really became this thing of people being like, I want to know more data. And so we realized that the pivot really was to focus on the data aspect. And like, even if we could be like, here's our suggestions for what you should try next, it was the baseline was that the baseline didn't exist of like even understanding your own sexual function. Like, I think most people, if you're like, oh, remember the last time you masturbated, what was good about it, what wasn't, like no one really thinks that hard about, you know, like you do it and you like move on with your day. And so we're like, oh, we need to give people place to pause and think about, reflect on what did work, what didn't work, what could make it better, like all of that. So I think that's where we really pivoted. Demographic, to be very honest, we really did think it was going to end up being more of your late 20s to like mid 30s people, because it was like a tech product at the beginning, and it was very like IoT device. But the coolest thing I think we've seen is that it's really all walks of life. Like, we have people with penises or men who use our products because you can get the same data anally. So one, we see that. And then one, we see like the biggest community that's super vocal and has given us the most words of encouragement and like some of the purchases is actually your older community. So like 50 plus community, who are like, oh, like, I can't believe a vibrator exists like this. Like, I want to know more about my body, or maybe my body's changing now. And so now I want to understand what those factors are. So we actually really have such a wide range. I think it's people just curious to learn about their body beyond what a regular vibrator can do, and like what the data means, and people that are mission driven of believing in this idea of expanding the research around it. So I think that's really become the full sweep of the people that we've had as our super fans. We've had a person email us. She was in her 70s or 80s, and she was like, I just had my first orgasm because of the Lioness. And she's like, I have it like monumentally as a graph. And I was like, I think that like every sad moment of my day, or I'm like, this is not going to work, or like, what are we going to do with our company? Like, I think about that from time to time, and it makes me just so like, we're doing this right. Like, we're doing something that makes sense for people. And so it's always been like a big like encouragement. And then Maggie, I can't remember what your question was.
Your competition, your thoughts on competition.
Oh,
yes.
So the sex toy industry is really interesting. So when we started 7 years ago, the coined term sex tech, which is, you know, what investors will use now, like, here's the sex tech industry, femtech industry. The term sex tech didn't actually exist. So in terms of competition, it was more of your kind of old school traditional companies that have been like, of course, every woman wants a pink and purple vibrator with butterflies on it. Like, why do we have to change it? So it really kind of started with that. So I would say competition wise, when people started hearing like there was a smart vibrator coming out with like biofeedback, people are like, that's not going to work, or, you know, like, why would anyone need this? So I think, and to this day, no one's integrated the technology that we have. Like, there's no other biofeedback vibrator currently out on the market. So it's always a little bit of a weird, I think we're in our own space, but at the same time, like, I tell this to people all the time, like, the sex tech industry is so small. To me, it's as if another company is winning, it's actually a win for everyone in the community, because it's a really hard industry to be a part of, because there's so much red tape. Like, when we try to open a bank account, they're like, you're a pornographic company. We can't open a bank account with us. And so, like, anytime there's a win or there's a huge investment made into a company, that's actually a proof point for everyone to be like, this is an industry worth investing in to grow in and like change the narrative around it. So I would say, like, competition wise, it's really hard to be like, yeah, we have to keep it super secret. Like, anytime people DM me and they're like, I have a sex toy idea, I'm like, yeah, let me know, like, let me help, like, okay, like, what advice do you want and stuff like that. Yeah, I just want to see people like growing in this field and especially have more representation. I think it's still a pretty specific representation in this community. We're seeing a lot of more women, but I think in terms of like people that look like me or people of color, like all that stuff is so still limited. And so like I would love to just see more people come into the space like that.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to you. It's a really tough industry to be in because there's a lot of stigmas against it, and I know particularly fundraising must be insanely hard for you because you have to frame your narrative in a way where it's like technically not pornographic but more tech based, and that's like
Mm-hmm.
when you look at companies like OnlyFans or Pornhub, like they can't raise institutional money because of the stigma against it, right? So with that being said, how did you fundraise? I would imagine like this is probably one of the most difficult things you have to do to talk to investors and really get them in the right frame of mind. And it really shows me how gritty you really are because you are what Forbes 30 under 30. Congratulations,
Oh,
congratulations on
thank you.
that. And on top of that, just continuing on for 7 years, that's a remarkable amount of time to be committed to any sort of project, right? 7 years. So like,
Yeah.
what was that fundraising process for you and bootstrapping and all that stuff? Because I'm pretty sure it daunted on your mind a lot in the early years.
Yeah. I mean, I think for sure, like we did it. I think even beyond being a sex tech company, there's a lot of interesting factors that played into it I always joke like we probably chose the hardest thing to want to do. Like as first time founders, consumer hardware is not a sexy space to be in. Hardware is a really hard space to like get investment in because it's so much capital up front. And then on top of it being sex tech, people being like it's a sexual company. So a lot of investors sometimes would be like, oh, our partners are not okay with it. They're super religious or whatever the thing is, or it's super male dominated. So a lot of times they're like, my wife doesn't masturbate, and then you're like, okay, like thank you for that information, like that has nothing to do with anything, but they use it as like a proof point of like, oh, vibrators are a super niche thing. So it's a wide scope. We definitely, I think, just as first time founders, like beyond this fact that it's sex tech, I think it was a big learning curve, right? It's so hard to really navigate how you're supposed to do it correctly, trying to follow other people's methods of how they did it. It's just never going to work for how you're working. I think the biggest lessons we learned, so we did end up raising our like pre-seed our team, I like always have to give shout outs to our team. We're incredibly small, but I can't imagine any other set of people that would have been able to launch a product that was with this much low, like not capital intensive, and then also just getting the product out there as fast as we did is like an incredible thing. And my team, I have nothing but like love and thanks to my team for getting that to happen. So we did invite like a fundraising round, and then we also did our Indiegogo at the time because it was the only way to prove via crowdfunding that this was a product that was going to do well, or people actually wanted a product like this because there wasn't any other product to really compare ourselves to. So those two things happening, and then I think the biggest lesson I've learned about fundraising, like I think it could deaden a lot of people. A lot of people get so scared by it, but to me, it's like you have to like whatever your product is, like you have like for us, like we always say like we're looking for the dreamers, the beautiful weirdos, the people that are willing to just think outside of what I don't know, like especially in Silicon Valley, this like idea of big tech and VR, AR, just like all sorts of like beyond that, and people being like, dang, this is actually something super innovative. I'm interested in just having those weird, like beautiful weirdos. And I mean that in the most best way possible. So I think we don't look actually for traditional like name, like big names of like, oh, this is going to be really big. Like we're looking for people that really believe one in our mission, and then two, understanding beyond like, hey, this doesn't exist. Like this is absolutely going to be a pioneering project. Like you're either in it or not. So I think we've gotten less delicate of feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to talk to this person. I'm so scared. Because now I'm like, hey, I'm Anna. Like, do you want to talk about like vibrators with me? Like, ask me any question you've ever had about sex, vibrators, masturbation, anything. Like, I'm here to answer because, like, I'm telling you, like, as a person that I've been scared of my body, like, this is where I am 7 years from now because of the Lioness. Like, ask me anything. So I think we come in more of just of like, hey, like, I don't know what else we can prove beyond we've survived for 7 years. We've
Mhm.
launched 2 products. Like, we've done hardware with like very little capital. Like, we have the right team. So like, what else do you need beyond that at this point? So I'm saying is like, this is a past year learned thing of just being like, I feel super confident in what we've built. Like, of course, the imposter syndrome the past 6 years was like so heavy and so like, are we doing the right thing? What am I doing with my life? My friends are buying houses and having babies. Like, what am I doing? Like, all of those things. And I like really for me, like last year was like all of that was like, damn, like I'm really proud of what we've built and like what we're doing. I think it's like the right thing. And I feel very confident in feeling good about it. So yeah, ask me maybe when we do another fundraising round, being like, how did it go? Like
Mhm.
how did you navigate it differently? But I'm gonna be like, oh, we kicked ass. Like I came in full force, like because we used to be scared to even be like, hey, it's a vibrator. We talked about it such in a medical sense, but now I just feel like it's a vibrator. It's doing cool medical stuff. It's doing cool research stuff, but it's a vibrator. Like touch it, like we built it, like all this stuff. I would be so much more upfront about it now.
Awesome. I hope this is not too personal to ask, but like, how has your own sexual journey evolved throughout creating this product? Because the way that I guess like the way that I'm listening to all your story, it's so interesting to hear like you evolve, not only the company evolved, right? But you also evolve yourself along with the product as well. What was
Definitely.
your sexual journey? I hope it's not too private to ask this question on this
No,
podcast,
not at
but
all.
like, what was that like as you're creating this and fully believe? Because to me, you're a person that fully embodies the mission that you're trying to build, right? That is a perfect
Mm-hmm.
sign of like a very passionate founder, right? I'm just kind of curious because I know like, and within our own Asian Hustle Network community, any Asian community is still huge stigma against talk about sex. The conversation like these are still very, very fascinating to a lot of people. And I just want to hear from your personal journey too. Like, what was that process like for you? What was the journey like?
Totally. Yes. Super happy to answer it. Yeah. So to dive a little bit deeper. So when I say I was scared of my body, like I experienced some trauma when I was a kid. And so that was what made me feel like I don't, I don't own my own body. Like I don't deserve, like this whole narrative in my head of like, I don't deserve sexual pleasure for myself because like I don't own my body is the way I thought about it, like growing up my entire life, well into my mid like 20s of having relationships and people being like, oh, well, what do you want? And I think a lot of times, especially, and I hear this is like really common story, and the same for me is like, I learned about sex and sexual pleasure because of my first, like losing my virginity and like having a partner. So you learn it a lot of times in the scope of somebody else, like their experience, their pleasure, what they think that sex should feel like or sexual pleasure should feel like, all of that. So I think like that was so much unlearning for me. And there's this always like constant narrative of like, if you're in a relationship, you're not, you don't need to masturbate or you don't need to have a toy. Like there's like that constant narrative I hear to this day. And I think a lot of times you're like, well, does that make me like weird? Does that make me too
So true.
hypersexual?
So true.
Yeah. And then like I've had relationships where when I was working on Lioness, like early days, they were like, hey, like don't tell my friends what you do, or like they won't tell their parents what they like. I do like a lot of like shame. So I think that in itself, I was like, oh, like, am I like what, you have this question of like, what's wrong with me? Or like, am I broken? And so for me, like, I think, I mean, also, I'm not going to like negate therapy. Like, I've had therapy since I was like in right after graduating college, and like knowing about therapy, first of all, was like, super helpful. But on top of it, like it was the journey of Linus for me is like learning about my body, of being like, oh, these are just physiological reactions, and then being able to be like, hey, when I drink a cup of coffee, it makes me actually feel so much more pleasure, but when I drink alcohol, it makes me not enjoy it as much, or I'm not as feeling as much sensation, and giving me the tools to talk about it in such a almost in a matter of fact way. And it made me super excited to be able to do that instead of being like, hey, I feel like, the foreplay sucks, or, like something that feels super argumentative and like sometimes people can take personally. I was just like, oh, for me, it just takes this long. Like I need it to be their specific way. Like it just became, I felt like I was becoming just more empowered about myself, and to the point where I was like, yeah, I'm going to start like an Instagram where I just talk about everything I've ever learned about sex, or on TikTok to talk about like, here are the things
Let's
I've
talk
tried.
about that. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about TikTok and Instagram. It's
Yes.
so for you guys that don't know, please follow Anna on her Instagram and TikTok because it's very educational but also very entertaining. So Anna, let's talk more about your leveraging social
Yes.
media.
Yes. So I really been it really started actually from Instagram. Like one of my friends was, I forgot what question he asked me, but it was one of those questions I was like, damn, you've known me for this long and I've never explained like maybe I was like, what materials is a safe for a vibrator to buy? And I was like, my God, like I can't believe I didn't do my job to like for you to know that answer. And so like my Instagram was, is super tiny. It was even like it was just my friends at the time. And I was like, I'm gonna just do a series of things I've learned about sex, because I've learned so many random things over the past 7 years of like that we clearly don't get in sex education for most people. So I started this like really random story on my Instagram stories of like, here's what I learned about the history of sex, like sex toys. Where did sex toys come from? Why are they the way they are now? Like just random stuff. And then people were like kept like messaging me like, oh my God, like I had no idea. And it's things that I take for granted of like that I've known for so long now. I'm like, oh yeah, everyone knows that you're never supposed to use a jade egg or whatever. And then I realized it's not common knowledge. So I started being like, oh, I should just post this on social media. And then it ended up being just ending up on TikTok of like, here, like quick thing I've learned, or like I read so many sex research papers that I was like here's a research paper on relationships where people know about your vibrator usage and how that increases romantic like relationships, builds a stronger relationship, like literal research proof on it. And then I was like, here's my data on like drinking coffee versus not having coffee, like stuff like that. And I realized like the community really built itself because I really didn't expect it at all. And it just kind of proves the point of how much lack of information there is and how desperate people are to get information. And there's a lot of questions I can't answer. It's like a lot of medical questions or research that has never existed before. But it's just like, man, so many people want to know things. And it doesn't have to feel gross or scary or being like, oh my God, we have to talk about sex. So I try to talk about it in like, as much as me being like, I'm still on this journey, I'm still learning stuff about myself, I'm still learning the right terms, the right language, right ways to talk about stuff. And I'm just like hoping people come on the journey of me being like, this is what I learned and like all of that. So I would like to call it a little placeholder until sex education in this state and country and the world gets significantly better than it is currently.
Yeah, I mean, I love your energy. I love your vibes. It's how you are in your TikTok videos and your Instagram videos. It's just how you are in this podcast. Like very bubbly, very
Oh, good.
lively, very educational, and it just shows that you are very authentic to your branding and who you are as a person. And it kind of shows us on the podcast too that you are very comfortable with who you are, and we love that. We want to see more of that.
Appreciate you.
So we love that a lot. Um, I know we touched base on this earlier, but what was that turning point for you where you started to shed your imposter syndrome and you're like, wow,
Mm.
we're making it. Like this is going to be a real thing. I know you mentioned like the first couple years, like first year and a half, you didn't pay yourself. You're struggling. You doubted yourself. Your friends are buying houses, but look at you now. Like your company is almost seven. Your Forbes 30 under 30. What was a major turning point where you're like, wow, we kept going and we
Mm.
never quit?
That's a good question. For me, it really wasn't any of the like as much as I'm super grateful to be like listed as a under 30 at Forbes, like all of those different things. But it felt again so imposter syndrome of like you see other people on the list and you're like, oh my God, they're like, finding cures for like different diseases. Like, what am I like, what am I really doing? And you start kind of going into this whole, like, did I make it because I'm like, because they just, I don't know, someone like accidentally boosted it, or like, I don't know, you just start having all these like things. And if anything, I feel like a lot of times it adds to it, because I think people think there's a certain presence that you have, then you're like, you're underwater, like swimming, and you're like frantic like a duck, right? And then you're like, oh, I'm doing all these things, but you're coming off so like, yeah, we're great. Like, I think startup life is absolutely not glamorous. I don't love that, especially in Silicon Valley, there's so much like glamorization of startup culture, like all of that, like, oh, you're supposed to grind yourself down to the bone. Like, I don't love that. So I think for me, I think maybe the turning point was really last year. I was just the only thing I can remember is like I was like driving home or something to the city, and then I just had this moment of like, I think maybe it's like finding moments of gratitude and like just grateful for what you've done, and then just being like, damn, we've been around for 7 years. And then I had a moment of, oh, is that too long? Like maybe we should be exiting, or, doing that classic unicorn journey as a Silicon Valley company, and then being like, all these things. And then I just started being like, oh my God, we're first-time founders. Like this is already against the statistics of surviving this long, as three first-time founders. We're 2 women founders. Our team is almost entirely women, like including the tech team, a part of the team. And then just being like, and working on things that like I never thought I thought I was going to be so strictly engineering, and now I'm doing like, the world of marketing, world of media, just everything that I like never thought I would be doing. And then being like, just realizing like hardware companies don't usually survive very long. It's a really, really hard space. And just being like, man, we did that with 5 people at the time. Like, my co-founder and I were like sleeping in the dorms in the Chinese manufacturing facilities to save money, and then also like be right next to the facility as soon as it opened, until it closed, like the last minute, like all of those things. And just be like, man, like our journey has been insane. Like I can't imagine what else I would do. And I think the question's always like, okay, well, if you aren't doing this company, would you do another startup? And I think like, for me, I'm so mission driven. Like it has to be something I resonate so deeply with, of being like, I think that's the only thing that I don't know, for me, like keeps me going, is like, well, like, yeah, like really stable income, and being sick and being like, hey, I'm not coming to work. And a corporation being like, okay, that's fine. Like there's like 20,000 other people that's covering for you would be nice. Having like amazing health insurance would be super nice. Like there's all these things that could be nice, but I think I really thought about like what my values are in life, and everyone's values are different. So you can't knock like a person killing it in a corporate job. Like if that value is there, like, yeah, that's so amazing. I think for me, I realized like I was really fulfilling my values, but I was really maybe the past years comparing my values to someone else's values, and being like, well, their value is to make a lot of money and then have start a family as soon as possible. And I realized like, I can't compare myself to that, because my values are different. And so I think as soon as I realigned what my values were, and then realized that I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing, and I could be like to my high school self being like, damn, you're killing it with everything that you've wanted to do after you graduate. I felt like really like at peace with myself. And I think that was probably like all the things that was going around in my brain, of just being like, yeah, I'm like doing this. I'm doing the thing that I wanted to do. And then just leaving it at that. I think also age just helps a little bit. Like I definitely believe like you, like in the 20s, you really go through like this whole, like you finding yourself, like, what am I doing? And then as soon as I just turned 30 this year, and I was like, really, there was like a turning point of me being like, man, I really don't care what people think about me. I'm just doing what I can, the best I can. And it felt really freeing. And I'm sure it only gets better as you keep aging and you just keep experiencing life.
I love it. Oh my gosh. You have had such a crazy journey, and it's just so amazing to hear. And I like Brian mentioned, I can just feel that you just own who you are, and if you had told us that you were scared to talk about vibrators or Lioness to, potential investors, I would have not even believed you, because of how confident you are in your own skin and confident about your own product and your own company. And to be honest, like, yes, it is natural for us to compare ourselves to others, right? But you are literally changing lives, Anna. Like, going back to the fact that like people were interested in getting a free vibrator. I think a lot of people, myself included, like I didn't feel comfortable with buying a vibrator. Like I was never confident enough to do that. I was always very scared to go into a store and buy something like that. But if I had heard like, oh, there's a free vibrator, like, yes, I'd be way down to get something like that. Like it's for market research,
Yes.
Or it's for research for my own body,
Yep.
But yeah, you are literally changing lives. And some people don't get to experience an orgasm for their entire lives. And to hear people say that they've had their first orgasm at the age of 70 something, that is amazing. You're like literally breaking barriers and helping others understand there's so much more to sexual wellness industry other than the stigmas that we hear on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's totally been a fun, like, it's such a trip. I think what we've like gone through in the past, like there's so many funny things that's happened. There's so many like crazy things that's happened to us. And there's moments when you're like, I'm going to keep a list of all the companies that have said like no to us or banned us from stuff or like all sorts of fun stuff. At the same time, you're like, man, you can't live like that. You just have to have total fun with it. So I think that's also a good way to like keep creativity alive in small businesses is like, instead of getting bitter, it's like, dude, we should do something funny about this is always the kind of cure for all of it and just being creative.
Yeah. I mean, very off topic, but when I mentioned to Maggie that, hey, like, we should get Anna on the podcast, she kept giggling. She's like, oh, I'm so excited for this podcast. She kept looking really, really forward to this. So thank you so much for being on the show. Like we truly appreciate that. And we'll continue to support in any way that we can. So we do have one final question. And that question is, what advice would you give to an aspiring entrepreneur trying to break into, I don't know how to say this, unconventional space? Because there is a lot of barrier to entry, and not just from like a barrier to entry, but like from a mental barrier as well. What advice do you have for them?
It's a good question. I would say two things. One's more recent. One I've been harping since like 5 years ago. The more recent one is I truly believe there's no entrepreneurship DNA. The only thing I think that makes somebody survive in it is just doing it. Like I realize the biggest friction is just like to do it, because you can constantly talk about like what you want to do, like what your dreams are. But the only difference of somebody that has a business or doesn't, or start their entrepreneurship journey, is to just do it. And yes, it's going to feel like, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing? But as long as you're doing it is like all you can really do. And then you keep at it is like the only difference that is like between an entrepreneur or not. The other one that I always like harp on since like 5 years ago is like to really focus on your intersections of skills versus like your core skills. So for me, I was so harping on like being a good engineer. And I was like, I want to be known as a really good engineer. Like I need to only do engineering stuff. I only want to run engineering projects, stuff like that. Like it's not conducive to building a business, because there's so much more that goes into a business beyond the engineering aspect of it. And there's a lot of engineers that are going to be really, really good, probably better than what you're doing. And that goes for like any skill set, any hobby, right? But really what the intersection of what you do and your passions and the other things you like doing, like that's what's going to make you the special talent. That's going to make you the only person that can do the business that you're doing. So for me, it's like, well, I'm already super passionate about sexual wellness and doing the science behind it and doing the engineering. And now like, man, like I would love to tell people as much as possible about it. And that all combines into the strength of, I think, our company and the brand that we built. And so I always say, like, think about what your intersections are. And even if it's things that you would never think intersect with each other, I promise it comes back. Like, I always say, like, I've like always been really into like skincare stuff. And I was like, I think this is just something I like. But now I'm like, we talk to a lot of like beauty influencers of like figuring out, like, oh, like, how do we talk about sex in a way that makes sense? And the connection of already knowing, like, I already watched so many beauty influencers like that I just genuinely love and stuff like that, being like, oh, these are the people that I want to reach out to because I know exactly, like, I've always loved them. And so it's really cool to kind of start seeing those intersections like all come together. So I hate when people are like, oh, you shouldn't do that hobby. It's a waste of time. Maybe I should be working instead. Like, dude, do the things that you like doing because it makes you like a whole person and it makes you the person that can run your company and not like just an engineer. I don't know, I'm engineer specific, but yeah, it relates to any skill set you have.
As a fellow engineer or former engineer, I totally know what you mean.
Yes. Oh my God. I tell engineers all the time, like take writing class. I would like if I can go back in time, I would have took philosophy classes, writing classes, and so many more humanities courses. Like I hate this whole like glorified engineering, what everything is like, damn, like that
So
only
true.
gets you so far.
Yeah, I know. I remember Brian was like, I want to be the best engineer. I feel like a lot of people tend to think that way. You know, they want to be the best in one specific thing, but you know, to
Yes.
be all encompassing and to be a good founder, you have to be good at, you know, you have to do and try different things and just be very versatile.
And as
Yes.
another disclaimer, being a founder is freaking hard. So
Yeah.
it's not as fun and carefree as we make this podcast sound, but it's extremely difficult. And it forces you to look really deep sometimes too deep. You're like, man, what am I doing? You're going to ask yourself that question all the time as a founder, right? And it never goes away,
Yes.
unfortunately.
It's very soul searching. Yes, and that's why maybe my other very realistic advice is like if you can and have access to therapy, get there. Like I say like everyone should have get therapy. Like it's the one thing that I think keeps me sane of like a sanity check beyond like my friends and people that know me. And it's like nice to get some outside perspective of like why am I thinking like this or like why like how do I get better at this or like all of this stuff. Yeah, it's a constant soul searching as a founder. You're just like and you're constantly like working with other people. You're trying to build other people up too, and you're like am I prepped to do this? So yes, being a founder is such a interesting. I always like love just such a side story, but like when people are like, oh, how are you doing? And it's like people that aren't in the entrepreneurship space and you're like, oh, it's good. Like it's awesome. And you're like, yeah, awesome. Like that's so cool. But I always, when I get on calls with like other founders, I'm always like, how's everything? And everyone, both of us are like, like it's like, like we're surviving. And like, it's just a funny, like, I mean, it's so fun, but it's just a funny thing to like. The way I respond, I think, is always so different depending on who I'm talking to.
Yeah,
so accurate.
Don't worry, we can start after this podcast.
Yeah,
I feel like Brian and I, we
reminisce
always
a little.
open our Zoom calls like that, like the
like
usual.
how's it going? Like okay, we're surviving. Like it's good. Like.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for that advice. I want to give our listeners an opportunity to find you and Lioness online. So tell us how we can find you online.
Yeah, so our website is Lioness, like the female lion.io. Our Instagram, our social media handles is Lioness Health, which is also really fun account. And then my personal account for Instagram is Anna is Average, and my TikTok is Anna the Average. I'll merge it at some point, but that's what it is.
One quick question. Why is it called Anna is Average?
Oh, can I tell the story? Is there time?
Yeah.
It's really short. But I this is such a classic of my personality, I feel like. So in college, when you first enter freshman year, like if you're with like your dorm, they're like do icebreakers. And I was like, this is how I'm going to reinvent myself. I want to be known as like so funny, like I'm going to be great. And so the icebreaker was to do your like the first letter of your name, like an adjective, and then your name, right? Like awesome Anna or whatever. And I was like, in my head, I was like, it's gonna be so funny if I say average Anna. Like, I just thought it was like funny at the time. And so I said it out loud when it was my turn, and everybody was like, oh my God, don't say that about yourself. Like, girl, you're not average, you're amazing. And then everyone went around saying like different adjectives starting with the letter A. That's like, oh, awesome, amazing. Like, and I was so horrified. And so the rest of the year in my dorm, people were like, thought of me as this like very low self-esteem, just like sad girl. And I was like, and so now I like, that's what I named my Instagram like very long time ago. And yeah, to this day, people are like, you're not average, like all this stuff. And I have to explain the story every single time.
I'm glad we got the backstory. I was about to be like, Anna, you're not average, you're awesome.
Well, maybe my humor is average and maybe the better
no,
information about it. But
awesome.
but I'm keeping it.
I mean, they're both average.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
just kidding.
exactly.
But yeah, thank you so much again for being on the podcast today. It's an awesome episode, and we definitely enjoyed it. And thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you both. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.